the huge personal responsibility as an executor of somebody's will and the potential consequences.
The impact of that on us has been legal fees of £90,000 and still ongoing. And the problem is there's no timeline, so the process just rumbles on and fees just keep going up.
When someone dies leaving money or property in a will, any inheritance tax is due exactly 6 months after the death. If the bulk of the estate's in property or shares, you can spread the cost of inheritance tax over 10 years, and you'll pay interest of 3% a year on what you owe. But if there are problems with a will and things drag out, you still have to pay the inheritance tax, and it is the executor's personal responsibility to pay. One of our listeners is in that situation. Her mother died in 2016 and the estate still isn't sorted out. I asked her why she agreed to be the executor of her mother's will.
My mother obviously wanted to make sure all her affairs and everything were dealt with by her children, and so my moral duty to her and to make, as a promise I made to her, I'd make sure everything was going to be sorted for her so she could be reassured and have peace of mind, really.
How much inheritance tax is due on your mother's estate?
At the moment, I believe it's 150,000 thereabouts. So it's quite a large sum of money, which I personally would never be able to settle unless, it was dealt with from the estate.
Now, in your mother's case, things haven't been at all straightforward because the will's being contested by a member of the family. What has been the impact of that?
The impact of that on us has been legal fees of £90,000 and still ongoing. And the problem is there's no timeline, there seems to be no checks, whether things are done within a certain time in order to pay HMRC. So the process just rumbles on and fees just keep going up.
Did you know that you would be liable to pay that inheritance tax straight away? Was any provision made for that?
Nobody ever mentions it. Nobody tells you. I spoke to HMRC and said, but we haven't been able to process everything in order to get the funds to pay you. They didn't want to know.
Have you been able to pay anything towards the outstanding inheritance tax bill?
We paid what cash was remaining within the estate. The bank said that you could do that if it went straight to HMRC, which is what happened. So they have had monies. We set up a 10-year instalment plan, so you pay 1 month a year over 10 years, a certain amount.
And how are you managing with that?
Well, we can't pay it because we haven't liquidated anything. We can't resolve anything because it's being contested.
Are there any special loans available?
Well, I went to our local bank because the solicitors had suggested you can get an executor's loan, although I found out that all executor loans were stopped back in 2014. The banks just don't do it anymore. And these are like, your big names on the high street. I went to 3 or 4 and it was all the same answer.
You've copied to us the letters that the tax people have sent you, and they say that due to the uncertainty of how long this legal dispute might take to be settled, they're not willing to wait indefinitely for payments to be made.
Correct. Yeah.
What do you say to that?
Well, I was absolutely horrified, to be honest. I went to my MP because obviously at this point, where do you go? Who do you turn to? He wrote to them and yet they still replied that they weren't prepared to stop pursuing the debt outstanding despite the situation.
HMRC has advised that all avenues of raising finance should be explored. What do you take that to mean?
I don't know. I mean, we've explored every avenue and there are no avenues available to us in order to settle the estate other than out of the estate. We personally don't have the funds to do that.
And how has all this affected you personally?
Well, it's been terrible for the family. We haven't been able to grieve. My mother doesn't even have a headstone. Normal things in the grieving process we haven't been able to do as a family. And of course, at the end of the day, my mother's wish not carried out. I feel like I've let her down. I don't understand the structure or the format of this particular area of law that isn't really conducive with modern day society or families. We've got lots of blended families. It just seems to be antiquated. It doesn't seem to fit with what's really going on in society.
So one of our listeners, well, Tara McInnes is a senior associate at Shoosmiths law firm and she specialises in probate.
It is unfortunately very common these days. There does seem to be an increase in the amount of disputes being brought against estates, and that will hold up the whole administration of an estate. And as you rightly said, HMRC is not going to wait. The tax becomes due 6 months after death, and they want paying. So it is a situation that does arise very frequently.
And if you're the executor, you're personally liable to make sure this inheritance tax is paid. That's pretty onerous, isn't it?
You are. And what your listener was saying, I don't know how common it is that people are advised of their personal liability when they take on the role as executor, because in most cases that role comes from a will. They might not even have been consulted as part of that will making, or they haven't been spoken to, so they might not even be aware that they are an executor until the will is proved.
You can't then say, I don't want to do it, or can you?
You can. So you can renounce probate, which means that you can say you don't want to take the grant, you don't want to be an executor, but you must do that sooner rather than later, because if you start to actively participate in dealing with the estate, then it becomes more complicated and you can't just renounce, which is a far more simple procedure. You just say you don't want to do it. So you can do that.
It seems incredibly unfair, doesn't it, that this listener's going to be made to pay inheritance tax when she might not even inherit anything from her mother in the end.
Well, it's difficult to respond to the exact circumstances, because obviously I don't know the particular case, but usually, I come across disputes all the time because I specialise in disputed wills and trusts, and usually where there is a dispute that's held up the payment of the tax, it is possible to negotiate with HMRC to pay in instalments or to get a loan or for them to take a charge against any property in the estate. So I think possibly your listener has definitely been very unfortunate in her case, because I see disputes all the time, and normally the inheritance tax, we reach some kind of agreement with HMRC regarding payment.
And can I ask you, when somebody disputes a will, who has to pay the legal costs of all that?
There are two different ways of actually challenging a will. You can challenge the will itself, in that you're saying the will's not valid, or you can bring a claim against the estate if you've been left out of the will. Certain people can. The usual rule is that the loser pays the winner's costs. So if you're defending a claim, again, you have no real say in that, you have no real choice. And if you do end up then paying the claimant something from the estate, you will usually be liable to pay the legal costs on top.
That also seems tough, doesn't it?
It is very tough, and it is very difficult to advise clients when they're the defendant and through no fault of their own somebody's brought a claim against the estate that they then have to defend, the stress involved in that, and having to fund the costs as well. It's very unfair.
You might assume, Tara, that if people have to pay inheritance tax, they're wealthy people anyway and they'll be okay. Is that usually the case?
No, that's not necessarily true. Properties these days can be worth quite a lot, especially in the south of England. So if it's over the sum of £325,000, then there is a risk of you having to pay tax.
That's Tara McInnes. Well, we asked the tax people, HMRC, about our listener's case, and they told us they do take individual circumstances into consideration and are committed to helping with the payment problems individuals face. They promise that they will contact our listener to talk through her options.